You want to hear a story? One that'll make you think twice before you ever step near the ocean again? All right, but don't say I didn't warn you. This happened 2 years ago. My name's Daniel, and I was just a regular guy. Mid-20s, loved to surf, spent most of my free time on the water. There's this spot off the coast of Oregon, a stretch of beach that barely anyone goes to. Locals call it Widow's Wake. A creepy name, I know. But the waves there? Perfect. I'd been surfing that spot for months, and not once had I seen another soul. That changed one late October evening. The sun was bleeding out over the horizon, and the tide was just right. I paddled out, waiting for the perfect wave, when I noticed something off. The ocean had gone dead silent. No gulls, no wind, no sound except for the slow, deep breath of the tide. Then I saw it. About 50 yards out, floating just at the edge of the last swell, was a boat. Old, rusted. Not some modern yacht, but one of those early 1900s fishing trawlers, the kind you only see in history books. And it was just sitting there. No movement, no lights, just bobbing like a corpse in the water. I stared at it, heart pounding. There hadn't been any boats when I paddled out. The Coast Guard never patrolled this stretch. Where the hell had it come from? That's when I saw her. A woman stood on the deck of that ghostly boat, her figure barely visible through the thickening mist. She was drenched, her long black hair plastered to her face. Even from that distance, I could see her eyes, dark, bottomless pits that swallowed the fading light. And she was staring right at me. I felt an icy weight settle in my gut. Then she raised her arm. Not in a wave, not in a beckon. She was pointing at me. I don't know why, but a cold dread washed over me. My instincts screamed, "Get the hell out of there!" I turned, paddling hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. But the moment I looked back over my shoulder, the boat was gone. Just vanished. Like it had never been there. I was breathing fast, trying to convince myself I was seeing things when something brushed against my foot. A hand, I screamed, jerking my leg away as something yanked me downward. My board flipped, and suddenly I was swallowed by the freezing black water. I thrashed, kicking, fighting, but the grip was impossible to break. It felt like ice-cold fingers were tightening around my ankle, dragging me deeper, deeper into the abyss. My lungs burned, and just as I was about to give in, about to drown, I saw her, that same woman. But this time she was below me, floating, her hair waving like black seaweed. Her eyes were open, empty voids, her mouth stretching into a horrible grin as she whispered something in the water. Words I couldn't hear but felt in my bones. Then, just like that, the grip on my ankle released. I shot up, gasping, coughing, sucking in precious air. My board was drifting a few feet away, and I clawed onto it, shaking, my whole body numb with fear. I paddled back to shore like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. I didn't even bother grabbing my things. I just ran. I ran all the way back to my car, shaking so hard I could barely get the keys in the ignition. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard the whispers, and then the dreams started. At first, they were small, the sound of water dripping, the distant creak of wood, but then I saw the boat, every night, drifting closer, closer, and always her, standing on the deck, watching me. The worst part, the dreams weren't just dreams. One morning, I woke up to find my bed soaked. Not sweat, not spilled water, salt water. The smell of brine clung to my skin, and on my ankle, bruises, shaped like fingers. I was losing my mind. Or so I thought. A week later, I was at a bar near the harbor, drinking, trying to forget, when I overheard some old fishermen talking. They mentioned Widow's Wake. I leaned in, desperate, asking what they knew. One of them, a man who looked older than the sea itself, fixed me with a knowing stare. "You saw her, didn't you?" he said. I felt the blood drain from my face. Turns out, the legend goes back over 100 years. A fishing boat, the Marlowe, vanished one night during a storm. It was found days later, wrecked against the rocks. No survivors. But the captain's wife, she never stopped looking. Every night, she'd walk the shore, calling for him, waiting for him to come back. She died out there, drowned herself in the same waters that took her husband. They say she never left. They say she still searches for him, and anyone she finds in those waters after dark, she takes them, just like she tried to take me. I moved inland after that. Haven't been back to the coast since, but sometimes late at night, I hear it. The sound of waves, a whisper, rising from the dark, calling my name. You still want to go surfing?
Story number 2.
You ever hear about Devil's Deep? No? Well, sit down. You might want to drink for this one. It's a stretch of ocean off the Florida coast, real deep, darker than the midnight sky. Boats avoid it, divers steer clear, and even the Coast Guard doesn't patrol there unless they have to. Locals say it's cursed. I didn't believe in any of that crap. Not until the summer of 21. I was working on a deep-sea fishing boat, good money, long hours. That day, we had a small crew, just me, the captain, and 2 deckhands. We were hauling in our last catch when the radio crackled. "Mayday, anyone, please," it was a woman's voice, weak, desperate. We exchanged looks. No distress calls had been reported. The captain grabbed the radio. "This is the Valerie Ann. What's your location?" Silence. Then in a whisper so faint I almost thought I imagined it, "Help me, he's coming." Then nothing. Static. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The captain checked the radar. Nothing. But then out of the mist, we saw it. A boat. A huge fishing trawler, dead in the water. No lights, no movement. Looked like it had been drifting for years, rust eating through its hull. And the name on the side? Maribel. The captain went pale. "The hell?" One of the deckhands whispered. "We shouldn't have gone aboard. We should have left. But we didn't." The captain grabbed a flashlight and we climbed onto the deck. It was silent. Too silent. No gulls, no waves slapping against the hull. The air was thick, heavy, wrong. We searched the wheelhouse first. The radio was smashed. Maps were scattered across the floor, torn like someone had clawed at them. The last log entry read, "He's here. I see him. Dear God, don't let him take me." It ended in a jagged ink-smudged line. Then we heard it. A scrape, slow, deliberate, metal against metal, from below deck. My gut screamed at me to run. The captain, gripping his knife, gestured for us to follow. We crept down the rusted stairs, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The smell hit us first. Rot, salt, and something worse. In the cargo hold, the nets were full, but not with fish, with bodies. Half-rotted eyeless, their mouths open in silent screams. One of the deckhands gagged, then a breath. Long, slow, right behind us. We turned, and there he was, a man or something that used to be a man, towering in the shadows. His skin was stretched too tight over his bones, his eyes black pits that swallowed our flashlight beams, his mouth stretched into an inhuman grin, lined with teeth too sharp, too many. He moved. Too fast. I ran. I don't know what happened to the others. I heard screaming, wet gurgling sounds. I didn't stop. I scrambled up the stairs, onto the deck, leaped over the side into the water. I swam like hell. Somehow I made it back to our boat. I screamed at the captain to start the engine, my voice raw, hands shaking. We left that ship behind. No one spoke on the way back. When we reached shore, we called the Coast Guard. They found nothing, no sign of the Maribel. No bodies, just empty ocean. I quit that job, moved inland. But sometimes at night, I hear it. A whisper rising from the depths, calling my name. And I know one day I'll see that boat again. And this time, I won't make it back.
Story number 3.
You ever hear about Black Tide Bay? It's a small stretch of beach on the East Coast, just south of Maine. You won't find it on most maps. The locals know it's there, but they don't talk about it. Not because they've forgotten, because they remember. I didn't believe the stories, thought they were just old sailor superstitions. I was a marine biology student at the time, fresh out of college, eager to prove myself. So when a research opportunity came up to study deep-sea life near Black Tide Bay, I jumped at the chance. I wish to God I hadn't. We were a small crew, me, Professor Graham, 2 grad students, and the boat captain, Wallace. Our job was simple. Drop sonar equipment, take readings, collect some deep-sea samples, and be out in 3 days. The first day was fine. The second, that's when the ocean turned against us. It started with the tide. The water near Black Tide Bay isn't normal. It's darker, heavier, like oil mixed with ink. On our sonar, the readings didn't make sense. Huge, shifting masses moving deep below us, too fast, too big to be schools of fish. Then the boat started acting up. Wallace cursed under his breath as the GPS flickered. The compass spun wildly. "This place ain't right," he muttered. That night, the ocean screamed. I woke to the sound. Deep, guttural wailing, like something massive was crying out from the depths. It rattled the windows, made my teeth ache. The others heard it too. We stood on the deck, flashlights scanning the water, but there was nothing, just the thick black waves rolling endlessly under the moonlight. Then, Graham pointed, look, about 20 yards from the boat, something was floating. At first, I thought it was driftwood, but as it bobbed closer, I saw the shape. A body, face down, bloated. Wallace swore, grabbing a pole to drag it closer. The second he touched it, the body moved. Not moved, turned. Its head snapped up, its face leering at us. Pale, eyes missing, mouth stretched into a grin far too wide, lips split and bleeding. Then it spoke. Not out loud. Inside my head. Let us in. I stumbled back, my vision blurring, my ears ringing. I could hear screaming, maybe mine, maybe the others. Then the body sank, just disappeared into the black. We should have left right then, but we didn't. The next morning, the ocean was still, too still. No waves, no wind. The air was thick, heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Wallace tried to start the engine. Nothing. That's when we saw them. Hands. Hundreds of them. Rising from the water, fingers black and dripping, clawing at the sides of the boat. I backed away, heart hammering as one hand gripped the railing, nails peeling back from bloated flesh, then another and another. Then they pulled themselves up. People, or what was left of them. Their skin hung in ragged strips, their mouths stretched open in silent screams. Water poured from their gaping jaws, black as tar. Graham was the first to go. One of them grabbed his wrist. He screamed, but the second their fingers touched his skin, his body froze. Then he changed. His eyes rolled back, his skin turned gray, and water poured from his mouth. He shuddered, twitched, then stood with them. We ran. I don't remember how we got the engine working. I don't remember how we made it back to shore, but I do remember the last thing I saw before we escaped. The ocean. It wasn't water anymore. It was eyes, thousands of them, just beneath the surface, staring, watching, waiting. We left Black Tide Bay behind, but I know it never left me. Sometimes at night I still hear the ocean screaming, and sometimes I hear a voice whispering in my head, "Let us in."
Story number 4.
You ever feel like the ocean is watching you? I never used to think that way. I grew up on the coast, spent my whole life near the water. My dad was a fisherman, and his dad before him. The sea was in our blood. But then I went out to Raven's Hollow, and I learned something. The ocean, it doesn't just watch, it waits. It started with a job, a good-paying one. Some rich guy had bought an old house on the cliffs near Raven's Hollow, like a stretch of coastline that people avoided for a reason no one liked to talk about. He wanted to restore the place, but first, he needed someone to check the foundation, see if it was stable. That's where I came in. I'm a diver, specialized in underwater construction. If there were cracks in the rock, if the sea had eaten away at the cliffs beneath the house, I'd find them. The first time I saw the house, I got this feeling. It was massive, dark windows staring out over the endless waves. The wind howled through the broken eaves like something was inside whispering, watching. I shook it off. Just an old house. Wallace, the foreman, met me at the shore. He didn't waste time on small talk, just handed me the coordinates, told me to be careful. Don't go too deep, he said. I should have listened. The water was calm that day. Too calm. Like the ocean was holding its breath. I suited up, checked my gear, and slipped beneath the surface. The first thing I noticed? It was dark. Darker than it should have been. Even with my light, the water swallowed everything past a few feet. The house sat on a rocky outcrop, and beneath it, jagged cliffs plunged deep into the abyss. The stone was old, cracked in places, but it held. At least, that's what I thought. Then I saw the opening. A cave. Massive. Hidden in the cliffside like a mouth yawning into the deep. I shouldn't have gone inside. I should not have gone inside. But I did. The second I crossed into that cave, the water changed. Colder, thicker. And the silence? Gone. Now there was a sound, a slow, deep thump, 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 like a heartbeat echoing through the water. I tried to tell myself it was just the current, the pressure playing tricks. Then my light flickered. For a split second, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, floating in the darkness. At first, I thought they were statues. Stone figures carved into the cave walls, but then I saw their faces, twisted. Mouths open in silent screams, their arms reaching forward like they had been swimming. No, struggling. When they turned to stone. I felt something behind me. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. I turned. Nothing. Just black water. But the feeling was still there. That pressure. That weight of something watching me. I needed to get out. I kicked hard, turning back toward the entrance. But the cave was deeper than before. The tunnel stretched on, impossibly long, as if the ocean had shifted around me. Then my radio crackled. Not Wallace. Not my crew. Something else. A voice. Help me. It was small, weak, like a child lost in the dark. I should have ignored it. I should have ignored it. But I didn't. I turned my light, and there, just ahead, was a shape. A girl. Drifting in the water, hair floating around her like ink, her pale face turned away. I reached out, and she moved. Not like she was swimming, like she was yanked. spun toward me by an unseen force. Her eyes were missing, her mouth hung open, black water spilling out. I screamed. The radio screeched, a noise so loud, so shrill it rattled my skull. And then, the hands. They shot out from the darkness, from the stone figures, from the cave walls, grabbing me, dragging me down. I kicked, thrashed, my air running low. My light spun wildly, cutting through the darkness, revealing glimpses, faces, frozen in horror, hands reaching, pulling, clawing, and in the center of it all, a shape, a figure larger than anything I could comprehend, shifting in the blackness. Something with eyes, hundreds of them, blinking, watching, waiting. I don't know how I got free. 1 second, I was drowning. The next, I was on the surface, gasping, choking on the cold morning air. Wallace pulled me onto the boat. I tried to tell him about the cave, the statues, the hands, but he just shook his head. You went too deep. That's all he said. I quit that day, packed my bags, moved inland, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them. The statues, the girl, the eyes, and I know the ocean hasn't forgotten me. It's waiting. One day I'll hear that voice again. Help me. And this time, I won't make it back.
Story number 5.
You ever hear about Redwater Cove? Most people haven't. It's not on any tourist maps, and the locals pretend it doesn't exist. But if you ask the old fishermen, the ones who've spent their whole lives near the sea, they'll tell you to stay the hell away from it. I wish I had listened. It started with a dare. I was working a summer job at a marina in Maine, fixing boats, hauling gear, boring stuff. One night, a group of us were drinking by the docks, swapping ghost stories. That's when someone brought up Redwater Cove. Place is cursed, one of the older guys said. A whole fishing crew vanished there back in the 50s. Only thing they ever found was their boat, drifting empty. No blood. No bodies. Someone else laughed. Probably just a storm. Nah, the old guy muttered. It's the water. Turns red just before it takes you. I should have ignored it, but I was 20, drunk and stupid. So when my buddy Eric bet me $50 I wouldn't spend the night there, I grabbed my gear, stole a boat, and set off for Redwater Cove. The place was eerie as hell. The cove was small, surrounded by jagged cliffs, and the water was wrong. It had a strange dark shimmer, like oil floating on the surface. The moment I dropped anchor, the air felt heavier, dead silent, no wind, no waves, just stillness. I set up my sleeping bag on the boat's deck, cracked open another beer, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Then the water changed. 1 second, it was the same dark shimmer. The next, red. Like someone had spilled gallons of blood into the sea. I leaned over, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was some kind of weird algae bloom. Then something touched my arm. I jerked back, nearly falling into the water. It was seaweed. At least that's what I thought at first. But it wasn't green. It was black. Thick, slick, pulsing like it was alive. I scrambled back, breathing hard, watching as more of it rose from the water. And that's when I saw the hands. Not seaweed. Fingers. Dozens of them, black and rotted, stretching up from beneath the waves, reaching for me. I grabbed my oar, started slamming it into the water, but the hands kept coming, crawling onto the boat, dragging themselves up, dripping, lifeless. And then, I heard the whispering. Low, guttural, like voices speaking from the bottom of the ocean. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt them. In my bones. In my mind. Then I saw them, figures. Rising from the red water, faces half-rotted, eyes missing, mouths stretched wide in silent screams. I knew I was dead. Then they stopped. Everything froze. The hands, the whispering, the figures. Then, in one horrible, jerking movement, they all turned toward the cliffs. Like something else was coming. And then I heard it. Not a whisper. Not a voice. A clicking sound. Deep. Hollow. Growing louder, and then something rose from the cove. Something huge. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand. It had too many arms, too many eyes, and its skin was black, writhing like the sea itself. And when it looked at me, I felt my mind break. I don't remember what happened next. I woke up the next morning, floating miles from the cove. My boat was wrecked, my radio was dead, but the worst part, my ears were bleeding, and in my head, I could still hear the whispering. I made it back to shore, never told anyone what I saw, but every night I hear the clicking, and every night I know it's still watching me, waiting, and one day it'll take me back.
Story number 6.
You ever hear about the phantom buoy? Sailors talk about it in whispers, a legend passed down through generations. It appears in the open sea, miles from any port or known fishing waters. No markings, no identification, just a lone, rusted buoy floating where it shouldn't be. And if you see it, you don't stop. You don't investigate. You turn your boat around and leave, because the ones who don't never come back. I didn't believe in any of that. Not until the summer of 2018. I was working as a deckhand on a commercial fishing boat, the Clara Belle. It was a good crew, tough guys, hard workers, no-nonsense types. We'd been out for a few days, hauling in a decent catch. Everything was normal, until we saw the buoy. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. I was untangling a net when Big Jake, one of the older crew members, suddenly went stiff. "Jesus," he muttered. I followed his gaze. There it was. A buoy. Old, rusted, bobbing gently in the waves. But something about it was wrong. No markings, no numbers, and the chain beneath it disappeared into the depths like it had no end. "Let's go around," Big Jake said, voice tight. But the captain, Wilson, just snorted. "It's a goddamn buoy." He turned the wheel, steering us closer. Jake grabbed his arm. "You don't mess with that thing," Wilson laughed. "It's a piece of metal, not a sea monster." We got closer. The air changed. It got thick, heavy, like the world had just stopped breathing. And then we heard it. A bell. Not loud, not like the normal clang of a buoy in the waves. This was slow, hollow, like something was knocking from inside it. I felt ice crawl up my spine. "Turn us around," Jake whispered. "Now." But Wilson was already grabbing a long pole, reaching out to tap the buoy. The second he touched it, the sea went silent. No wind, no waves, no gulls, just silence. Then, boom, something slammed into the side of the boat, nearly knocking me over. Wilson cursed, stumbling back. Jake was already running to the wheel. "We have to go." I looked over the side and froze. The water was moving, not waves. Something underneath, something huge. Dark shapes swirled beneath the surface, too fast, too big to be fish. They twisted, circling the boat, rising just enough for me to see flashes of pale, bloated skin. And then the hands started reaching up. Hundreds of them, not human. Too long, too thin, fingers curling, clawing. One of the younger deckhands, Mike, screamed and grabbed a knife, hacking at them as they latched onto the hull. Then we saw the face. It rose from the water, just beyond the buoy, gray, swollen, eyeless. A man's face, mouth hanging open, lips split, black water spilling out. Then it smiled. The deckhand screamed. A hand shot out, grabbing his ankle. He didn't even have time to struggle. He was just gone, dragged under, swallowed by the dark. Jake throttled the engine. The boat lurched forward. For a moment, I thought we weren't going to make it. The hands, the faces, the things, they were everywhere. Then a sound split the air, a low, wailing moan coming from the buoy, and suddenly they let go. The hands, the faces, gone. The boat surged forward, and then we were free. We didn't stop until we were miles away. No one spoke. No one looked back. When we reached shore, Wilson quit. Never went back to sea. Jake wouldn't talk about what happened. And Mike, he was gone. Lost. No body. Just gone. A week later, I had a dream. I was back on the boat. The water was still, and in the distance, I saw the buoy. And Mike, he was standing on it. His skin was gray, his eyes were missing, and when he opened his mouth, black water spilled out. I woke up screaming. I moved inland after that, haven't been back to the sea since, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I hear a bell. Slow, hollow, like something is knocking.
Story number 7.
You ever hear about the drowned man of Devil's Deep? I wish I hadn't. It was just a story, one the old fisherman told, meant to scare newbies like me. But some stories are real. Some things in the ocean don't stay dead. I found that out the hard way. I was working as a deckhand on a crab boat out of Massachusetts. The Orca's Grin was a tough little vessel, and the captain, Murphy, was even tougher. The guy had been fishing these waters for 30 years, knew every current, every trick the ocean could pull. But even Murphy had one rule. "Never drop pots near Devil's Deep," he said one night. Devil's Deep was a trench, a black chasm in the sea where the water ran too dark, too cold. It was miles offshore, a place where compasses spun wild, radios cut out, and things went missing. Murphy wouldn't even sail near it. But storms make men desperate. We were behind on our haul, a storm was rolling in, and the crabs had been scarce. That's when the radar picked up movement, big movement, just outside the boundary of Devil's Deep. Murphy hesitated. Then, against his own rule, he steered us closer. We dropped the pots. The ocean swallowed them whole, and that's when the screaming started. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then I realized it was coming from the water, A low, ragged wail, growing louder. Human. I ran to the rail. Murphy grabbed my arm. Don't look, he hissed. But I did, and I saw a man floating just beyond the boat. His body was bloated, his skin pale and ripped open, as if he'd been torn apart by the sea. His eyes were gone, black sockets staring into nothing. But the worst part, he was smiling. Mouth split wide, lips curling, teeth too white, too perfect against the rotting flesh. Then he spoke, not out loud, in my head. You're already dead. I stumbled back, the world tilted. The air felt thick, wrong, too heavy to breathe. Murphy grabbed me, shook me. Don't listen. I tried to look away, but then the hands rose from the sea. Not just one, hundreds. Fingers blackened, too long, too thin, clawing at the boat, scraping the hull. And the drowned man, he laughed, a bubbling, gurgling sound as water spilled from his mouth, pouring down his chin like ink. Murphy was already at the controls, slamming the throttle forward. The boat lurched, engines roaring, but the hands, they didn't let go. The boat dragged, slowed, as if something was pulling us under. Then, a crack, one of the pots we had dropped, shot back up, not empty, not full of crabs, full of bones, human bones, ribs, a skull still grinning. I heard a snap, the rope tore free, and then, just like that, the hands were gone. The drowned man sank beneath the waves, his laughter echoing as he disappeared. We gunned it. Didn't stop until we were miles away. Murphy never spoke about it. The crew, they left. And me, I still see him. When I close my eyes, I see that smile. And sometimes I hear him whispering, "You're already dead." One day I think he'll be right.
Story number 8.
I should have never taken that boat. It was free, abandoned, floating near the docks, tied up but with no name, no registration, like it had just appeared out of nowhere. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I was broke, lost my job, barely scraping by. When I found the boat, it felt like a sign, a clean 30-foot fishing vessel just sitting there, waiting. I asked around. Nobody knew who it belonged to. Nobody wanted it. And so I took it. That was my first mistake. The first night on board, I started hearing knocking, soft, hollow, coming from inside the hull. I told myself it was the tide, the wood shifting. Boats make noises, right? But the next night, the knocking got louder. And it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, a pattern, like someone knocking to come in. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard breathing, not my own, not from the deck, but from below. The third night, I decided to check the hull. I grabbed a flashlight, pried open the hatch, and climbed down. The air was thick, stale. And the second I stepped inside, I smelled it. Salt and rot. And then the water moved. A ripple spreading across the dark pool at the bottom of the hull, but this boat wasn't leaking. There shouldn't have been any water down there. Then the knocking came again, right behind me. I spun around, light shaking, and for a split second, I saw fingers, wet, curling around the edge of the wood. I bolted. I should have left the boat then, but I didn't, because the next morning I found footprints on the deck. Wet footprints, leading from the hull, stopping inches from where I had been sleeping. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe I tracked in water, maybe it was just condensation. I kept telling myself that until the storm came. It hit fast. 1 minute the sea was calm, the next the sky went black. The wind screamed through the rigging and the waves turned to walls of water. I tried to start the engine. It wouldn't turn over. Then the boat lurched, like something was pulling it down. I ran to the rail and froze because someone was standing in the water, not swimming. A figure, half submerged, rising and falling with the waves, its face pale and wrong. Then it grinned, mouth too wide, splitting its face, teeth black as the sea. I backed away, and that's when I heard the hatch creak open, the one I locked. I turned. The door to the hull was open, and something was coming up the steps, dripping, dragging. The boat tilted hard, like something massive was beneath it. I ran for the radio, but all I heard was static. Then, through the noise, a voice whispered, "You took what was mine." The deck cracked. I felt the whole boat shift, first tilting as if something was climbing aboard. I didn't wait. I grabbed a flare gun, aimed it at the hull, and fired. The whole lower deck went up in flames. The boat screamed, not the fire, not the wind. The boat itself. Something howled from below, something old and angry. And then The water swallowed me whole. I woke up on the shore. No boat, no wreckage, just the taste of salt and rot in my mouth. I asked the harbor master about it, about the nameless vessel. He went pale. There ain't been a boat like that in years. I asked what happened to it. He wouldn't tell me. But I already know, because sometimes when the tide rolls in, I still hear it. The knocking. Slow, hollow, like it's still waiting for me.